Zane Flores was 42 years old and worked as a senior systems analyst at Halcyon Therapeutics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Around the office, people believed he was the kind of employee companies quietly removed during budget cuts. His cracked Android phone buzzed through meetings beside a frayed charging cable wrapped in gray tape. He carried lunch in an old plastic container and rode the MBTA every morning without speaking to anyone. What they didn't know was that 48 minutes earlier, Zane had wired $80 million into the company. Grant Holloway leaned over the conference table, smirking at the broken phone in front of him just as the screen lit up. Wire confirmed, $80 million received. Zane flipped the phone face down before Grant could finish reading. Before we keep going, drop your country and local time in the comments. It's always interesting seeing where everyone is watching from. And if you enjoy slow burn stories where quiet people turn out to be the most dangerous ones in the room, subscribe now. Tomorrow's story gets even colder. Halcyon Therapeutics stood 6 blocks from the Charles River in a slab of reflective glass and steel that looked more successful from the outside than it actually was. The lobby smelled like polished stone and burnt espresso. Investors liked that smell. Employees learned to hate it. Every morning at 7:12, Zane Flores stepped off the red line at Kendall/MYT station with the same black backpack hanging from one shoulder. He walked past biotech founders in tailored coats, past interns carrying cold brew coffees worth more than his lunch, and crossed Binney Street without looking at his phone once. The phone itself looked like something rescued from a lost and found bin. The black case had peeled at the corners. One side of the screen carried a spiderweb crack beneath dull fingerprints. Gray electrical tape held the charging cable together near the connector. People noticed. People always noticed. Zane entered Building 4 through the employee side entrance instead of the main lobby. He nodded once to the security guard Marcus Hill, who had worked there long enough to understand that quiet people usually saw more than loud ones. "Morning, Zane." "Morning." That was usually the entire conversation. The systems department occupied the 4th floor beside regulatory compliance. No windows, constant fluorescent light. The hum of server cooling systems behind locked access doors. Zane preferred it that way. He sat at the same desk every day. Dual monitors. One mechanical keyboard polished smooth from years of use. A small cactus near the corner. No family photos. No awards. No personal decorations besides a Red Sox mug holding black pens. At 8:03, Ethan Pike arrived carrying enough energy for 3 people. "Morning, gentlemen," Ethan announced to the room, even though only 2 other analysts were present. Another beautiful day in the collapsing paradise. He tossed his designer coat across his chair and noticed Zane untangling the taped charger. "Still using that thing," Ethan laughed. "Man, I swear your phone belongs in a museum." Zane plugged it in without answering. Ethan walked closer, grinning. "What is that now?" 5 years old, 6 still works," Zane said. "That's exactly what people say about fax machines." The others chuckled softly, not because the joke was funny, because Ethan Pike was senior sales leadership and laughing made office life easier. Zane opened 3 financial monitoring windows on his left screen while Ethan continued talking about a rooftop networking event in Back Bay, attended by venture capital executives and pharmaceutical consultants. Most of the stories sounded inflated. Zane suspected many of them were. At 8:45, the company-wide operations meeting began on the 12th floor. The conference room overlooked Kendall Square. Rain streaked across the tall windows while executives arranged tablets and catered breakfast trays around the long glass table. Grant Holloway entered last. He always did. Tall, expensive navy suit, perfect silver watch, the kind of voice built for conference microphones and quarterly earnings calls. Grant noticed Zane immediately, mostly because Zane looked like he did not belong in rooms designed for people like Grant. "There he is," Grant said loudly while pouring coffee. "Halcyon's last surviving flip phone user." "It's not a flip phone," Ethan added. "Give him another year." More laughter. Zane sat near the end of the table close to the wall monitor. Quiet. Still. Grant continued speaking while checking slides on the screen. "We need modernization across every department," he said. "Image matters. Investors notice details." His eyes drifted briefly toward Zane's phone lying beside a yellow legal pad. The implication hung in the room. People smirked into their coffee cups. Zane watched the presentation without reacting. But beneath the stillness, he counted numbers, not sales projections, not marketing forecasts, real numbers. 3 weeks earlier, he had started noticing irregular payment routing through Halcyon's internal systems. At first, it looked small: scattered consulting expenses, delayed approvals, duplicate vendor IDs. Then the patterns repeated. A biotech company already struggling with cash flow should not have been approving seven-figure consulting transfers every quarter, especially not while laying off researchers. Grant clicked through another slide showing strategic restructuring initiatives. Translation: more cuts. A woman from clinical operations asked whether another reduction round was coming before Q4. Grant gave a practiced executive smile. We're optimizing operational efficiency. Nobody in the room looked reassured. Zane glanced down at his notebook. He had written 4 vendor names there already: Northline Advisory Group, East Harbor Analytics, Belmere Consulting, Apex Strategic Solutions. 3 addresses traced back to mailbox centers. One used a disconnected phone number registered in Nevada. The company was bleeding money quietly, and somebody inside Halcyon already knew it. The meeting ended at 10:14. Employees scattered back into elevators carrying leftover pastries wrapped in napkins. As Zane stepped into the hallway, Ethan caught up beside him. "You ever think about upgrading your wardrobe too?" Ethan asked casually. "I mean, we're not curing diseases in a garage anymore." Zane pressed the elevator button. The brushed steel doors opened. Inside, Ethan continued talking. "Seriously, man, you know people judge that stuff." "I know," Zane replied. The answer made Ethan pause for half a second. Not defensive, not embarrassed, just calm. The elevator reached the 4th floor. Zane walked out first. By noon, rain hammered against the building hard enough to blur the city skyline. Employees gathered in break rooms discussing rumors of bankruptcy acquisition or another mass layoff before Christmas. Zane ate lunch alone at his desk: turkey sandwich, apple slices, bottled water. His monitors displayed internal transaction logs beside server access histories. At 12:43, he found another payment authorization connected to Northline Advisory Group: $842,000. Approved under Grant Holloway's executive credentials. Zane leaned back slowly. Not surprise, confirmation. He opened another encrypted archive stored locally on an external drive disguised as an old backup unit. Inside were copies of payment records, timestamps, server access routes, deleted invoice trails, and administrative override logs. Months of quiet collection. He never rushed evidence. People made mistakes when emotional. Systems rarely did. His phone vibrated once against the desk. Unknown secure sender. Zane unlocked it with his thumb. A single encrypted email waited inside a private mailbox. From Caldwell and Boone, LLP. Subject: Final conditions approved. Zane read the message carefully. The audit authority package had been finalized. Full access rights confirmed. Emergency financial review authorized immediately upon fund release. Outside forensic investigators already on standby. He locked the screen again. Across the office floor, Ethan laughed loudly at something on his monitor while Grant Holloway walked through departments shaking hands like a politician during campaign season. Vanessa Reed emerged from the executive elevators wearing a cream-colored coat and carrying a folder marked Confidential Financials. She smiled at employees, too easily, too often. Zane watched her disappear behind glass conference doors. Then he looked back at the transaction histories glowing across his monitor. Millions leaving the company. Researchers losing jobs. Executives celebrating networking dinners in Manhattan. Outside, rainwater streamed down the building windows in crooked lines. Inside, Halcyon Therapeutics was already drowning. Most people just hadn't realized how deep the water had become. Yet. By Thursday morning, rumors of another layoff spread through Halcyon Therapeutics faster than flu season. Nobody spoke about it directly at first. People lowered their voices near elevators. Slack messages disappeared seconds after being sent. Managers closed office doors during conversations that lasted too long. Fear had its own sound inside corporate buildings. Quiet keyboards. Forced laughter. The absence of confidence. At 7:26 a.m., Zane Flores sat alone in the 4th floor systems office, reviewing overnight transaction reports while the building slowly filled around him. The lights above his desk buzzed faintly. A half-finished coffee cooled beside his keyboard. On his left monitor, financial routing logs scrolled line by line through encrypted accounting channels most employees didn't even know existed. On his right monitor sat a spreadsheet he had built himself. Dates, vendor IDs, approval chains, transfer totals, patterns. That was what mattered. Not excuses. Patterns. At 8:11, an internal company email landed in every employee inbox. From Vanessa Reed. Subject Strategic Realignment Update. Nobody needed to open it to know what it meant. Still, people did. Some employees read standing up. Others pretended not to care. A few stared blankly at screens without blinking long enough to make coworkers uncomfortable. The message promised operational optimization and resource alignment for long-term sustainability. Corporate language always became more polished when people were about to lose their jobs. At 8:34, two junior researchers walked past Zane's desk. "You think it's our department?" one whispered. "Has to be," the other replied. "Clinical funding's already frozen." They noticed Zane nearby and lowered their voices further, not because he intimidated them, because everyone assumed systems analysts heard everything. They weren't wrong. Zane reopened the overnight payment queue. Another transfer had cleared after midnight, $417,000. Recipient East Harbor Analytics. The company claimed to provide predictive pharmaceutical market modeling. Its registered office was a UPS store in Newark, Delaware. Zane zoomed in on the approval chain. Executive authorization Vanessa Reed. Secondary approval override Grant Holloway. He stared at the screen for several seconds, then copied the entire transaction into a secure archive. No emotion crossed his face. But inside his thoughts, another piece locked into place. At 9 o'clock, the executive operations meeting began. Grant Holloway walked into the conference room carrying himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed consequences only happened to other people. Vanessa Reed sat beside him in a tailored cream blazer, flipping through printed projections while assistants arranged bottled water around the table. The atmosphere felt rehearsed, too smooth. Grant tapped the table lightly. "Let's get started." Slides filled the wall monitor. Cost reduction initiatives, restructuring forecasts, departmental efficiency charts. Every graph pointed downward. One of the directors from biomedical research leaned forward. "You're cutting another 42 positions?" she asked carefully. Vanessa answered before Grant could. "We're adapting to current market realities." "What market realities?" the director pressed. "We had funding secured for Q3. Grant smiled the way executives smiled before saying something dishonest. Unfortunately, capital conditions shifted. Zane sat near the far corner, typing notes quietly into a legal pad. Capital conditions. Interesting phrase, especially considering nearly $12 million had disappeared through shell vendors during the last 14 months. Grant continued speaking. "Everyone here needs to understand this is temporary pain for long-term survival." Temporary pain. The phrase irritated Zane more than the layoffs themselves, because temporary pain always belonged to employees, never executives, never the people approving luxury consulting contracts and private networking retreats in Manhattan hotels. Halfway through the meeting, Ethan Pike leaned sideways toward another sales manager and nodded subtly at Zane's phone lying beside his notebook. The manager smirked. Ethan whispered something. Both laughed quietly. Grant noticed and joined in without even hearing the joke. That was how office hierarchies worked. People synchronized cruelty for social convenience. Zane kept writing. At 10:18, the meeting ended. As employees filed out, Vanessa stopped beside Grant near the hallway windows, overlooking Main Street. Zane passed close enough to hear fragments. Investors getting nervous. Need cleaner numbers before the board review. Cannot let compliance start digging. Grant noticed Zane approaching and immediately changed tone. "Morning, Zane," he said casually. "Morning." Grant glanced at the old Android phone in Zane's hand. "You know, I've got an extra iPhone sitting at home somewhere. Might donate it to the museum fund." Ethan laughed too loudly behind him. Vanessa smiled politely without fully participating. Zane nodded once. "That's generous." Then he walked away. Not defensive, not embarrassed. That unsettled Grant more than anger would have. People like Grant understood insecurity. understood social pressure, understood performance, but calm silence gave them nothing to control. Back on the fourth floor, Zane locked his office door and connected an external drive to his workstation. The drive looked ancient, scratched metal casing, faded manufacturer sticker. Inside it sat nearly 9 months of archived internal records. He opened a folder labeled Northline. Invoices appeared instantly, dozens of them, consulting reviews, market expansion analysis, operational advisory services. Most were professionally formatted, all fraudulent. Zane traced routing data through internal server histories. Every approval chain eventually crossed the same executive authorization cluster. Grant Holloway, Vanessa Reed, sometimes both. He enlarged one particular transfer history, $2.8 million. Destination account rerouted 3 separate times within 48 hours. Final recipient hidden behind a Cayman Islands holding company. Zane leaned back slowly. Rain tapped against the narrow office windows beside the hallway. The building's ventilation system hummed overhead. Outside his office, employees discussed severance rumors and LinkedIn recruiters. Inside, Zane watched theft unfold in spreadsheets. At 12:06 p.m., he received another encrypted message from Caldwell and Boone, LLP. The subject line read, "Confirmation of conditional authority." He opened it carefully. The legal framework was now complete. Once funds transferred from Flores Capital Partners Halcyon would automatically trigger an independent forensic audit under investor protection clauses. Executive financial records could be seized. Internal systems could be reviewed. Board members could be suspended if evidence of fraud emerged. Zane read the message twice, then archived it. He looked through the glass wall of his office toward the open workspace beyond. Ethan Pike stood near the coffee station bragging about a dinner reservation at Miss Strahl in Boston's South End. A junior analyst nearby laughed too hard at something unfunny. Another employee quietly updated her resume on LinkedIn while pretending to review spreadsheets. Everyone sensed the instability. Nobody saw the real reason yet. At 1:17 p.m., Zane returned to the transaction logs. This time he expanded the search parameters wider. 14 months. All executive-approved external consulting transfers above $100,000. The system processed for several seconds. Then the results populated. Zane's eyes moved steadily down the numbers. $610,000. $940,000. $1.3 million. $780,000. Repeated patterns, repeated names, repeated authorization chains. He exported the totals into a separate calculation sheet. Then he stopped moving entirely. Bottom line total $11,428,614. Gone. Not market losses. Not failed research spending. Not operational costs. Transferred, rerouted, hidden. A biotech company had nearly collapsed while executives quietly siphoned money through fake vendors and offshore channels. Outside the office, somebody laughed loudly near the elevators. Inside, Zane stared at the final number glowing pale blue against the monitor. $11.4 million. Enough to save departments, enough to preserve careers, enough to keep scientists working. Instead, Halcyon prepared another round of layoffs while the people responsible toasted each other at executive dinners. Zane closed the spreadsheet carefully. Then he created another backup copy. He never trusted only one version of the truth, especially when powerful people became desperate. Friday afternoon carried the strange exhaustion that only existed inside struggling companies. Nobody relaxed. People only pretended to. At 12:31 p.m., the cafeteria on Halcyon's 8th floor filled with forced conversations and microwave smells. Rain had stopped outside, leaving gray clouds hanging low over Cambridge, while employees crowded around small circular tables pretending the company was stable. Televisions mounted near the ceiling played muted financial news. Biotech stocks scrolled red across the bottom ticker. Zane Flores stood near the vending machines waiting for black coffee from a machine old enough to groan while brewing. His lunch sat under one arm in the same faded plastic container he had carried for years. Turkey sandwich. Apple slices. No chips. No restaurant delivery. No $28 salads ordered through corporate apps. Simple routines made people invisible. Zane understood that better than most. Across the cafeteria, Ethan Pike spotted him immediately. "Speak of the devil!" Ethan announced loudly to two sales managers seated nearby, the last man in Boston still carrying Tupperware. A few people laughed automatically. Ethan waved him over. "Come on, Zane, sit with us. We're discussing modern technology." That usually meant humiliation disguised as humor. Zane walked over anyway. Grant Holloway sat at the far side of the table, scrolling through emails on a polished silver iPhone, while Vanessa Reed reviewed printed reports beside him. Several department leads occupied the remaining seats, eating expensive catered lunches from a nearby executive meeting. Zane placed his coffee down quietly. Ethan leaned forward immediately. "Show Vanessa your phone," he said. No, Zane replied calmly. That only encouraged Ethan more. "Come on. Seriously, I need confirmation people still use those after 2021. Grant looked up from his screen. "Maybe it's sentimental," he said. "Like owning a vintage car without the value." More laughter. One of the HR managers looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. Nobody wanted attention redirected toward themselves. Ethan pointed toward the taped charging cable hanging from Zane's backpack. "I'm telling you, one spark from that thing, and the whole building goes down." Grant smirked. "We should start a fundraiser. Get the man a real phone." Zane unwrapped his sandwich slowly. No reaction, no irritation. That bothered Ethan slightly. Bullies preferred visible damage. Vanessa finally glanced up from her papers. "You really never upgrade anything, do you?" she asked casually. Her tone carried less cruelty than curiosity. Zane took a bite before answering. "If something still works, I keep using it." Grant shook his head. That mindset's why people stay stuck. The comment hung in the air longer than the others. Not because it was profound, because Grant believed it. To him, appearance and value were interchangeable concepts. Watches, cars, phones, restaurants, neighborhoods. Everything existed to signal status. Zane drank coffee quietly while the conversation shifted toward an upcoming biotech networking summit in Manhattan. Ethan described rooftop bars and venture capital parties with exaggerated enthusiasm. Grant discussed investor relationships. Vanessa mentioned pending board pressure. Nobody asked Zane anything else. They rarely did once the joke ended. At 12:57 p.m., Zane's phone vibrated against the table. The cracked screen lit briefly. "Unknown secure line." Ethan noticed immediately. "Oh my God," he laughed. "It even rings like a scam call." Grant chuckled without looking up. Probably his extended warranty. The others laughed again. Zane stood. "I need to take this." "Don't lose signal in the 20th century," Ethan called after him. Zane walked out without responding. The hallway outside the cafeteria felt colder and quieter. Fluorescent lights reflected against polished tile floors while distant elevator chimes echoed through the building. He answered the call near a window overlooking Binney Street traffic below. Zane Flores speaking. A calm male voice answered immediately. "Mr. Flores, this is Daniel Boone from Caldwell and Boone LLP. Zane watched a delivery truck stop outside the loading dock. "Go ahead. The investment committee finalized approval 23 minutes ago." No excitement entered Zane's expression. Only focus. "And the conditions?" "All accepted." Boone replied. "Full forensic audit authority, executive compliance review, immediate access clauses upon transfer." Zane remained silent for a moment. Below him, employees crossed the street carrying coffee cups beneath cloudy skies, unaware their company stood less than a week from collapse. "And the board?" Zane asked. "Two members pushed back initially," Boone said. "Once they reviewed the financial exposure, resistance disappeared." "Good." Boone lowered his voice slightly. "Once the wire hits, there will be attention. You understand that?" "I know." "The executives still don't know Flores Capital Partners belongs to you know." Another brief silence. "Would you prefer we continue shielding your identity until the audit begins?" "Yes." Boone paused carefully before continuing. "There's something else. Rutherford Compliance already assembled the forensic team. They're prepared to enter Halcyon immediately after confirmation." Zane looked through the cafeteria glass wall nearby. Grant Holloway stood laughing beside Ethan Pike while waving a stainless steel espresso spoon for emphasis during some story. Neither man looked remotely concerned. "Understood," Zane said. One more thing, Boone added. The transfer authorization tablet is ready. We'll need final biometric confirmation before release. I'll handle it. The call ended. Zane lowered the phone slowly. For several seconds, he stood motionless beside the window. Not nervous, not uncertain, just thinking. He had spent months watching numbers disappear through carefully disguised channels while researchers lost grants and entire departments prepared for layoffs. People like Grant believed intelligence announced itself loudly. Luxury watches, sharp suits, aggressive confidence. But real leverage preferred silence. Silence collected evidence. Silence waited. Inside the cafeteria, laughter erupted again. Zane slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned to the table. Ethan immediately grinned. So Nigerian prince finally send the money? Grant laughed harder at that one. Zane sat down calmly. No, he said. Just legal work. Grant raised an eyebrow. Legal work? Personal matters. Vanessa glanced at him briefly again. Something about his tone made her pay slightly closer attention this time. Not fear, not suspicion, just curiosity. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Well, if your lawyer's helping negotiate a new phone plan, we fully support it. More laughter rolled around the table. Zane folded the empty sandwich wrapper carefully and placed it back inside the container. He never rushed movements, never performed anger for people expecting it. At 1:18 p.m., his phone vibrated once more. A secure notification appeared. Final authorization window open. Zane looked at the message for less than 2 seconds before locking the screen again. Grant noticed. That thing even capable of texting. Barely Zane replied. The table laughed again. Vanessa checked her watch. We need to head upstairs, she said to Grant. Board prep starts in 20 minutes. Grant stood adjusting his cufflinks. As he passed behind Zane, his eyes dropped briefly toward the old phone resting near the coffee cup. You know, Grant said casually, image matters more than people think. Zane looked up at him. Grant continued, people decide what you're worth before you even speak. Then he walked away with Vanessa toward the executive elevators. Ethan followed close behind, still smiling at his own jokes. The cafeteria slowly emptied. Plastic trays clattered into bins. Muted television anchors discussed market volatility overhead. Zane remained seated alone for another minute. Then he unlocked the secure notification again. Final authorization ready. Flores Capital Partners. Transfer amount, $80 million. A small biometric confirmation icon pulsed at the bottom of the screen. Zane stared at it quietly. Not because of the money. Money had stopped impressing him years ago. But because once he approved the transfer, the people upstairs would unknowingly begin walking toward the collapse of everything they had built around lies. He pressed his thumb against the screen. Authorization accepted. At 4:40 p.m., Zane Flores left Halcyon Therapeutics through the underground parking exit instead of the main lobby. Most employees were still upstairs pretending to work while quietly searching job listings in hidden browser tabs. Cambridge traffic crawled through wet streets under low gray clouds. The city carried that damp metallic smell that followed rainstorms near the Charles River. Zane walked past rows of expensive electric cars and crossed toward the subway entrance without urgency. His black backpack rested against one shoulder. The old Android phone remained in his coat pocket beside a folded MBTA transit receipt. Nobody looking at him would have guessed he controlled enough capital to purchase the entire building behind him. That was the point. The Red Line carried him 3 stops south into downtown Boston. He exited near Post Office Square and walked another 4 blocks toward the financial district, where old stone buildings stood beside mirrored towers, housing firms that moved billions before lunch. Men in tailored coats rushed along sidewalks, speaking into wireless headsets. Women in heels crossed intersections carrying leather portfolios. Nobody noticed Zane. Again, exactly the point. At 5:18 p.m., he stopped in front of First Dominion Private Banking. The building rose 22 stories above Federal Street with dark glass and brushed steel entrances guarded by 2 security officers wearing discreet earpieces beneath expensive overcoats. One of the guards opened the door immediately when he saw Zane. "Good evening, Mr. Flores." Zane nodded once. Inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. The lobby smelled faintly of cedarwood and polished marble. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers while receptionists in charcoal uniforms greeted clients by name before they reached the desk. Nobody here laughed at his phone. Nobody looked twice at the worn jacket. Money at this level stopped caring about appearances because real wealth recognized patterns ordinary people missed. A private banking associate approached quickly. "Mr. Flores, they're ready for you upstairs." "Thank you." The associate guided him toward a restricted elevator requiring biometric clearance. On the ride up, neither man spoke. The elevator opened directly into a quiet executive floor overlooking downtown Boston. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the harbor in silver evening light. A conference room door stood open ahead. Inside waited three people: Daniel Boone from Caldwell and Boone LLP, Senior Banking Director Eleanor Whitmore, and a compliance officer seated beside a secure transfer terminal. All three stood when Zane entered. "Good evening," Mr. Flores, Whitmore said warmly. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair and the calm posture of someone who managed fortunes large enough to destabilize governments if mishandled. "Evening." Boone slid a folder across the table. "All final conditions are prepared." Zane sat without removing his coat. The folder contained over 200 pages. Investment authority agreements, emergency stabilization clauses, forensic audit triggers, executive liability conditions, automatic governance intervention rights, everything structured beneath Flores Capital Partners. Not his personal name. Not yet. Whitmore folded her hands carefully. "Before we proceed," she said, "I'm obligated to confirm once more that this transfer is irreversible after execution. I understand. $80 million will move immediately into Halcyon Therapeutics under conditional control authority. Once the funds settle, Rutherford Compliance Group will activate full investigative access under investor protection statutes." "I know." Boone studied him briefly. "You're unusually calm tonight." Zane glanced toward the harbor through the glass. "Panic doesn't improve decisions." Nobody disagreed. The compliance officer activated the transfer terminal. Several encrypted screens illuminated simultaneously across the table. "Beginning authorization sequence," the officer announced. A digital account summary appeared. Flores Capital Partners. Total available liquid position: $412 million. Transfer amount: $80 million. Destination: Halcyon Therapeutics, NC. Whitmore watched Zane carefully. Most people changed physically when numbers that large appeared in front of them. Breathing shifted, eyes widened, hands moved differently. Zane only reviewed the conditions again, slowly, methodically. That calm came from experience, not arrogance. Years earlier, after selling a biomedical data infrastructure company, few people outside private equity circles had ever heard of Zane learned something important. The loudest people in finance usually controlled the least. Real leverage preferred privacy. At 5:42 p.m., Boone opened another document. "One issue remains," he said. Zane looked up. "The Halcyon executive team still believes this rescue funding came through traditional venture negotiations." "Yes." "You understand what happens once your identity becomes public?" "I do." Whitmore spoke carefully. "Your role inside the company may become complicated." Zane almost smiled at that. Complicated. A restrained word for what was coming. Upstairs at Halcyon, people still mocked his phone during meetings. Meanwhile, the man they considered socially invisible was preparing to seize effective control of the company before Monday morning. The compliance officer interrupted softly. "Ready for biometric confirmation." The transfer tablet rotated toward Zane. A secure black screen displayed authorization fields requiring fingerprint verification and voice confirmation. He placed his right thumb against the scanner. Green light. Voice authorization required, the system announced. Zane spoke evenly. "Zane Flores authorizing release of conditional investment transfer under Flores Capital Partners." The system processed for several seconds. Authorization accepted. Whitmore exhaled quietly. The compliance officer typed several final commands before looking up. "Final release pending." Boone leaned back slightly. "Once this executes, Rutherford's forensic team will enter Halcyon within 24 hours. "Good." Whitmore studied him again. You genuinely believe the company can survive this? Zane answered without hesitation. The researchers can. A brief silence followed. That answer mattered, because Zane never cared about saving executives, or stock prices, or corporate branding. Halcyon possessed valuable cancer research programs buried beneath corrupt leadership. Scientists were losing jobs while executives rerouted millions through fake consulting firms. That was the part he refused to ignore. At 5:51 p.m., the final confirmation window appeared. Release funds, yes/no. The room became very quiet. Rainwater slid slowly down the glass windows behind them. Far below Boston, traffic moved in glowing lines through the financial district. Boone folded his hands. Whitmore remained perfectly still. The compliance officer waited beside the terminal. Zane looked at the screen. Not dramatic, not emotional, just final. Then he pressed yes. The system processed immediately. Transfer initializing. Encrypted routing channels appeared across multiple monitors. Numbers shifted rapidly through secured financial pathways protected by institutional banking layers few people ever saw. The amount moved too large for ordinary processing speeds. Several seconds passed. Then another. Finally, the center monitor flashed green. Wire complete, $80 million successfully released. No applause followed. No celebration. Real money rarely behaved theatrically. Whitmore extended her hand across the table. Congratulations, Mr. Flores. Zane shook it once. Boone closed the legal folder. I'll notify Rutherford Compliance that conditions are active. Do that. The compliance officer gathered the authentication devices while Whitmore poured sparkling water into crystal glasses no one touched. You understand, she said carefully, the Halcyon executives are going to assume this money saved them. Zane slipped the old Android phone from his pocket and checked the confirmation notification lighting the cracked screen. Yes, he said quietly. That's why they won't see the audit coming. Outside the conference room, the evening skyline darkened over Boston Harbor. Inside, Halcyon Therapeutics executives still believed they controlled the future. They didn't know the transfer had already changed ownership of the room they stood in. And they definitely didn't know the quiet systems analyst with the taped phone now possessed the legal authority to expose every hidden dollar they had stolen. At 5:58 p.m., Zane stood and placed the phone back into his coat pocket. The screen glowed one final time before fading dark again. Wire confirmed. Funds released. The first domino had fallen. Monday morning arrived with the kind of artificial optimism corporations manufactured right before disaster. At 7:48 a.m., Halcyon Therapeutics buzzed louder than usual. Employees gathered in clusters near elevators holding coffee cups and half-whispered theories. News had spread over the weekend that an outside investment firm had injected emergency capital into the company. Nobody knew the amount yet. Nobody knew the conditions. But people smiled for the first time in weeks. Research teams believed layoffs might stop. Junior analysts relaxed slightly. One scientist in the oncology division openly cried in a hallway after hearing her department funding might survive another quarter. Hope returned quickly to desperate places. Zane Flores walked through the lobby unnoticed, carrying the same black backpack and the same old phone with the cracked screen. The security guard Marcus nodded once. Morning, Zane. Morning. Marcus leaned closer. Heard the company got rescued. So I heard. The elevator doors opened. Inside, two marketing associates discussed rumors excitedly. 100 million, maybe. No way. More like 50. Either way, Grant Holloway probably pulled it off. Yeah, he's been everywhere lately. Zane stood silently beside them while the elevator climbed. People always credited the loudest person in the room. At 8:12, an emergency all-hands executive meeting filled the 12th floor conference room. Catered breakfast lined the side counters. Fresh flowers appeared near the windows. Somebody had even replaced the burnt coffee machine usually ignored for months. Money changed moods fast. Grant Holloway entered wearing a dark tailored suit and a pale blue tie chosen carefully enough to suggest confidence without appearing celebratory. Vanessa Reed followed close behind carrying printed briefing packets. Ethan Pike already sat near the center of the table grinning at his phone. Ladies and gentlemen, Grant announced, I think today's finally a good day around here. People laughed too eagerly. Grant enjoyed that. A large presentation screen illuminated behind him, displaying one sentence in bold white letters: Halcyon secures strategic investment partnership. Applause broke out immediately, not because employees trusted leadership, because people wanted relief. Grant accepted the applause like a politician at a campaign rally. I'm proud to announce he continued that, after extensive negotiations and high-level discussions over the past several months, Halcyon has secured a major financial stabilization agreement. Several department managers visibly relaxed. Someone near the back whispered, "Thank God." Grant paced slowly near the screen. This investment ensures continuity moving forward. Research operations continue. Strategic restructuring remains manageable. Most importantly, Halcyon survives. More applause. Zane sat near the far end of the table beside the wall monitor, saying nothing. His old Android phone rested screen down near a yellow legal pad. Ethan noticed it immediately. Even during a corporate rescue announcement, some people remained committed to small cruelties. Unbelievable. Ethan muttered loudly enough for nearby employees to hear. Company survives $80 million, but Zane's phone still doesn't. A few people laughed automatically. Grant glanced toward Zane and smiled. You know what, maybe our first company expense should be helping systems analytics enter modern civilization. More laughter rolled around the room. Vanessa Reed smiled politely while reviewing her notes. She seemed distracted, not nervous exactly, but alert. Grant continued his presentation. Now, obviously, partnerships like this don't happen overnight. These negotiations required strong relationships, trust, and strategic vision. Translation Grant intended to take full credit. The slides behind him displayed financial recovery forecasts and projected stabilization timelines prepared overnight by the executive team. Everything looked polished, professional, controlled. Zane watched quietly while Grant described months of networking and investor confidence building. Every sentence contained just enough truth to support the lie wrapped around it. At 8:41, Vanessa stepped forward to discuss financial restructuring. Moving ahead, she said smoothly, "We expect operational confidence to return rapidly. Media communications are already being prepared. Internal stability remains our highest priority." Zane noticed something small. Her left hand tapped the presentation remote twice against the table between sentences. Tiny, nervous habit. Interesting. She knew more than Grant did. Not everything, but enough to feel uneasy. Ethan leaned sideways toward a sales manager. "Imagine the kind of people behind $80 million, he whispered. "Probably some private equity sharks flying around Manhattan in helicopters." The sales manager smirked. "Definitely not riding the subway with a lunchbox." Both glanced toward Zane. Neither lowered their voices. Zane wrote another quiet note on his legal pad. At 9:03, the conference room doors opened unexpectedly. The interruption cut directly through Vanessa's presentation. 3 unfamiliar people entered. 2 men, 1 woman. Dark suits, professional posture, no wasted movement. Each carried slim black portfolios embossed with silver lettering. Rutherford Compliance Group. The room fell silent almost instantly. Grant blinked once, then smiled the practiced executive smile again. "Can we help you?" The woman stepped forward calmly. "Rebecca Sloan," she said. "Senior Forensic Compliance Director, Rutherford Compliance Group." She handed Vanessa a document packet. "We're here under investor authorization." Vanessa took the papers slowly. Grant's smile weakened almost invisibly. "What exactly is this regarding?" he asked. Sloan remained expressionless. Immediate forensic review procedures attached to the stabilization agreement finalized Friday evening. Nobody in the room moved. Several department managers exchanged confused looks. Grant recovered first. "Well, certainly. Standard investor diligence." "Not standard," Sloan corrected gently. That single sentence shifted the atmosphere. The room no longer felt celebratory. It felt observed. Sloan continued. "Our team will require unrestricted access to financial records, vendor authorizations, executive communications, payment, routing histories, and internal systems." Ethan sat up straighter. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around the document packet. Grant laughed once, controlled, dismissive. "Of course," he said. "Halcyon has nothing to hide. Sloan met his eyes calmly. That's usually what we hear. Silence settled heavily after that. Zane watched the room carefully. Not the executives, the employees. Fear spread fastest through ordinary people because they rarely knew whether investigations protected them or endangered them. A research manager near the back whispered quietly, "What's happening?" Nobody answered. Grant stepped closer toward Sloan. "I'd appreciate advanced coordination before external teams disrupt operations." "We already coordinated with Investor Legal Counsel," Sloan replied. Vanessa opened the document packet rapidly, now scanning lines faster with each page. Her expression changed slightly at paragraph 3. Zane noticed immediately. There it was. The first real crack. Grant still believed he controlled the room. Vanessa had started realizing he might not. Sloan continued speaking. "Our auditors will begin departmental reviews this morning. IT infrastructure access will also be required." Grant turned instinctively toward the systems side of the room. Toward Zane. "Fine," he said. "Coordinate through analytics and back-end support." Sloan followed his gaze. Her eyes landed briefly on Zane Flores sitting quietly beside the wall monitor. No recognition appeared. Not publicly. But she held eye contact 1 second longer than necessary. Then nodded once. Professional? Controlled? Enough. Ethan leaned toward another manager again. "Poor Zane," he whispered. "Maybe they'll audit his dinosaur phone first." Quiet laughter followed. Zane finally looked up. Not angry, not offended, just steady. Outside the conference room windows, gray clouds drifted low over Cambridge, while traffic crawled along Memorial Drive beside the river. Inside, executives still believed this was a routine financial review attached to investment money. They didn't understand the audit had already begun before the meeting started. They didn't understand the funding itself was the trap. And they definitely didn't understand the quiet man they mocked over a cracked Android phone had personally opened the door for the people now standing inside the room. At 9:17 a.m., Rebecca Sloan closed her portfolio. "Our team will begin downstairs." Grant forced another smile. "Welcome to Halcyon." Sloan nodded politely. Then her team turned and walked out. The conference room remained silent several seconds after the doors closed. Nobody touched the catered breakfast anymore. Nobody laughed, not even Ethan. Zane looked down at his old phone as it vibrated softly against the glass table. A new secure notification appeared across the cracked screen. Rutherford access confirmed. Phase 1 active. He locked the screen again before anyone else could read it. By 10:06 a.m., the mood inside Halcyon Therapeutics had completely changed. 3 hours earlier, employees had been talking about survival. Now they talked about audits. The difference mattered. Hope made people louder. Fear made them whisper. Groups formed near printers and break rooms across every floor. Department managers suddenly became difficult to find. Executives closed office doors more often. Slack channels that normally carried jokes and meeting complaints turned quiet, except for work-related messages written too carefully. Rutherford Compliance Group moved through the building with controlled efficiency. No raised voices. No dramatic accusations. Just clipboards, secured laptops, and direct questions. That professionalism unsettled people more than anger would have. At 10:18, Rebecca Sloan and her team entered the fourth-floor systems department, accompanied by an internal legal coordinator. Employees looked up immediately. Keyboard sounds slowed. Nobody liked seeing investigators walk toward server infrastructure. Zane Flores remained seated at his desk, reviewing access histories when Sloan approached. "Mr. Flores." He looked up calmly. "Yes. I'm Rebecca Sloan. We met upstairs." "I remember." Sloan placed a thin document folder beside his keyboard. "We need access to archived financial routing logs, vendor authorization histories, and back-end approval records going back 18 months. "Okay." No hesitation, no nervousness. That caught Sloan's attention immediately. Most employees reacted one of two ways around forensic auditors: too defensive, or too eager to help. Zane sounded like someone discussing weather. Sloan glanced briefly around the office before lowering her voice slightly. "Can we speak privately?" Zane stood and led her toward a small secondary systems room near the server corridor. The room smelled faintly of cooled metal and recycled air. Low blue status lights blinked across hardware racks behind reinforced glass partitions. Sloane closed the door softly. "You already know what we're going to find, don't you?" she asked. Zane looked at her for a moment. Interesting question. Not because of the words, because she was smarter than Grant Holloway. "I know the payment structures don't make sense," he replied carefully. "That's a very measured answer. It's an accurate one." Sloane opened a notebook. "Did anyone instruct you to preserve records before our arrival?" "No, but you preserved them anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Zane glanced through the small glass window toward the office floor outside where employees pretended not to watch the conversation. "Because deleted data still leaves patterns," he said. That answer made Sloane pause briefly. Not emotionally, professionally. She had spent years around fraud investigations. Most people described evidence emotionally. Zane described systems. "Can you provide us access?" she asked. "Yes." He walked to a secured workstation mounted against the wall and inserted a scratched external drive into a side port. Within seconds, encrypted directories appeared across the screen. Archive A, Archive B, exec, routing, vendor maps. Sloane's eyes narrowed slightly. "You organized all this yourself?" "Yes." "How long?" 9 months. That answer landed heavily inside the quiet room. 9 months. While executives laughed at his phone and mocked his clothes, Zane had quietly documented the internal anatomy of financial fraud. Sloane opened several folders rapidly. Timestamp records, duplicate invoice trails, approval chains, deleted authorization restorations, everything meticulously indexed. "You expected this would eventually happen," she said quietly. Zane didn't answer immediately. Outside the room, Ethan Pike walked past, pretending not to stare through the glass. "People stealing money usually get greedy before they get careful," Zane said finally. Sloane looked back toward the screen. "You've done half our work already." "Not half." "Why not report it sooner? Because accusations without leverage become career suicide." That answer stayed with her. Because it was true. At 10:52 a.m., Rutherford auditors began tracing vendor relationships through the files Zane provided. Within 40 minutes, the first major inconsistency surfaced. Northline Advisory Group, the consulting company supposedly receiving millions for strategic market analysis. One auditor frowned at his monitor. "This address is a mailbox center." Another looked up. "No active employee records either." Sloane remained expressionless while reviewing transfer histories. Cross-reference approval routing. The auditors worked quickly. Every chain eventually looped back toward executive authorization accounts. Grant Holloway, Vanessa Reed, sometimes layered through secondary approvals designed to appear routine. Sloane's phone vibrated once. She checked the message silently, then looked toward Zane. "We need complete executive access logs." "I have them." Of course he did. Back upstairs on the executive floor, tension finally started reaching Grant Holloway. At 11:14 a.m., he stormed out of his office carrying printed audit requests, while Vanessa Reed followed close behind. "This is getting excessive," Grant snapped quietly. "They're pulling vendor contracts from 2 years ago." Vanessa kept walking. "Because someone gave them reason to." Grant stopped near the elevators. "You think I don't know how audits work? I think you underestimated the investor conditions." Grant lowered his voice further. "No investor commits $80 million without expectations." Vanessa looked at him carefully. "Expectations are different from forensic teams." For the first time since the audit began, uncertainty crossed Grant's face. Small, brief, but real. Meanwhile, downstairs, Rutherford's analysts uncovered another problem. 3 separate vendor companies shared overlapping authorization metadata, same approval timing, same routing structure, same back-end override signatures. Not coincidence. Design. At 11:47 a.m., Sloane entered a temporary audit room converted from an unused conference area on the 7th floor. Documents covered tables. Transaction maps filled whiteboards. 2 auditors compared offshore transfer structures, while another reconstructed deleted payment approvals from archived logs. Sloane placed Zane's drive carefully onto the table. "Where'd this come from?" one investigator asked. "Internal systems analyst." The investigator looked surprised. This organized Sloane nodded once. "Very. Another auditor reviewed timestamp chains. Whoever built these archives knew exactly what mattered. Sloan didn't respond immediately because she had started realizing something uncomfortable. Zane Flores wasn't merely observant. He was patient, and patient people were dangerous in ways loud people rarely understood. At 12:16 p.m., Ethan Pike entered the fourth-floor break room carrying an overpriced smoothie while talking nervously to two sales associates. "This whole thing's ridiculous," he muttered. "Auditors act like we're Enron." One associate lowered her voice. "They're reviewing executive approvals." So, so maybe something's wrong," Ethan scoffed. "Grant knows what he's doing, but his confidence sounded thinner now." Across the room, Zane filled a paper cup with black coffee without joining the conversation. Ethan noticed him immediately. "You helping the investigators now?" he asked with forced humor. "Providing system access," Zane replied. Ethan smirked weakly. "Careful, they might audit your ancient phone next." No one laughed this time. That silence bothered Ethan more than insults would have. Zane stirred coffee slowly, then walked out. At 1:03 p.m., Rutherford investigators discovered the first direct financial link between Northline Advisory Group and a former university roommate of Grant Holloway. The room went completely quiet after the confirmation appeared. One auditor leaned back slowly. "Well," he muttered. "There it is." Sloan immediately requested expanded authorization for executive communications review. Things accelerated after that. Fast, too fast for Grant to contain. At 1:28 p.m., Sloan personally entered Grant Holloway's office with two compliance analysts. Grant stood behind his desk immediately. "What now?" "We need access to your vendor communications. You already have procurement records. We now require direct correspondence." Grant forced a laugh. "This is becoming invasive." Sloan remained calm. "Investor conditions authorize complete forensic review." Grant's jaw tightened. "You people realize I helped secure this funding, right?" Sloan held his gaze evenly. "No," she said. "We realize someone did." That answer landed harder than she intended. Grant stared at her, then toward the hallway beyond the office glass. Down the corridor, Zane Flores walked calmly past, carrying a paper coffee cup and the same old black backpack. Quiet, ordinary, forgettable. Exactly the kind of man Grant Holloway had spent months mocking without a second thought. And for the first time since the auditors arrived, a very small piece of instinctive fear touched the edge of Grant's expression. Because somewhere beneath the noise and paperwork and investigations, the quiet systems analysts seemed to know too much. By Tuesday morning, the atmosphere inside Halcyon Therapeutics felt less like a biotech company and more like a building waiting for bad news to become official. Nobody trusted elevators anymore. People lowered voices the moment executives walked by. Doors stayed partially closed during meetings. Employees refreshed email inboxes every few minutes, expecting announcements nobody wanted to receive. The forensic audit had become the only real conversation in the building. And the deeper Rutherford compliance dug, the uglier the numbers became. At 8:02 a.m., Zane Flores sat alone in the systems office, reviewing overnight access requests while pale morning light filtered weakly through rain-streaked windows. His old Android phone charged beside the keyboard, using the same taped cable Ethan Pike mocked almost daily. The battery percentage climbed painfully slowly. Across the office floor, two junior analysts whispered while pretending to work. "They pulled executive email backups last night." "No way. I heard legal was involved." "You think somebody's getting fired?" The second analyst looked toward the executive elevators. "I think somebody already knows they are." Zane continued typing without acknowledging either conversation. His monitor displayed back-end timestamp chains tied to Northline Advisory Group. The routing patterns now formed a complete structure: vendor authorization, internal override, transfer release, secondary offshore redistribution, repeated again and again, like veins carrying stolen money through the body of the company. At 8:37 a.m., Rebecca Sloan entered the systems department carrying a black portfolio and two printed folders. "Morning, Mr. Flores." "Morning." She placed the folders beside him. "We confirmed direct financial overlap between Northline Advisory and two additional consulting entities." Zane looked briefly at the files. East Harbor and Belmere Sloan paused. You already suspected. The approval patterns matched. Sloan studied him carefully. Most people in Zane's position would have shown satisfaction by now. Vindication, resentment, some visible emotional reaction. Instead, he spoke like an engineer reviewing system errors. We also recovered deleted executive correspondence, Sloan continued. Somebody attempted partial deletion late Sunday night, Grant. We can't conclude intent yet, but both of them already understood the answer. At 9:11 a.m., an emergency executive coordination meeting began upstairs. Grant Holloway entered visibly irritated for the first time since the audit started. Not panicked, not yet, but pressure had started breaking through the polished executive performance. Vanessa Reed looked worse, darkness beneath her eyes, coffee untouched beside her tablet. She read legal updates continuously while avoiding direct eye contact with anyone. Department leaders sat quietly around the conference table while Rutherford representatives prepared additional document requests. Grant opened aggressively. This investigation is disrupting operations. Rebecca Sloan remained calm. The company signed compliance authorization willingly. Grant leaned forward. We agreed to investor oversight, not a hostile occupation. Sloan slid another document across the table. These transfers originated from executive-level approvals tied to shell vendors. The room became still. One board advisor adjusted his glasses carefully. What shell vendors? Sloan opened the folder. Northline Advisory Group, Belmere Consulting, East Harbor Analytics. Vanessa finally spoke. These were approved consulting entities, registered to mailbox facilities, Sloan replied evenly. No verified employees, no operational infrastructure. Grant laughed once, sharp, disbelieving. You're drawing conclusions from incomplete records. No, Sloan said quietly. We're drawing conclusions from complete ones. That sentence landed heavily across the room. Zane sat near the wall monitor, taking notes silently. Grant noticed him watching. Something about that calm attention irritated him more each hour. Maybe Grant snapped, suddenly we should discuss how internal systems logs are being interpreted. Nobody answered immediately. Grant turned partially toward the room. Back-end records can be manipulated. Anyone with administrative access knows that. There it was. The beginning of blame redistribution. Vanessa looked at him sharply. Too sharply. Interesting, Grant continued. I'm simply saying technical staff shouldn't become the sole source of investigative assumptions. His eyes shifted toward Zane openly now. A board member frowned. You believe systems data was altered? I believe Grant said carefully, certain employees may misunderstand context. Zane remained completely still. Sloan looked toward him. Mr. Flores, she said calmly, did you maintain archived transaction histories? Yes. Independent backups. Yes. Time-stamped yes. Grant folded his arms. And how exactly are we supposed to verify those weren't manipulated? The room waited. Several executives looked toward Zane for the first time, not as background noise, but as a variable. Zane opened his notebook slowly. Then he stood. Not dramatic, not angry, just deliberate. He walked toward the conference room display system and connected a small external drive from his backpack. The scratched metal casing looked old enough to be ignored by almost anyone else. The monitor illuminated instantly. Directories appeared. Archived routing logs. Server authorization histories. Redundant timestamp records. Sloan stepped closer. Zane opened the first file. Every transaction carried layered timestamp verification synchronized against independent server clocks and third-party backup mirrors. Impossible to fabricate retroactively without leaving corruption traces. He opened another, then another. Approval chains, deleted edits, administrative overrides, complete, clean, precise. Grant's expression tightened slightly. Zane finally spoke. These backups were created automatically every 6 hours beginning 9 months ago. One board advisor leaned forward. Why? Because payment structures became inconsistent. Grant scoffed immediately. So you started secretly collecting executive records? No, Zane replied calmly. I started preserving company records. That difference mattered. Everyone in the room felt it. Vanessa looked down at the folders in front of her without speaking. Sloan reviewed the timestamps carefully. Independent mirror validation confirmed, one Rutherford analyst said quietly from the back of the room. Grant's jaw tightened harder. He shifted strategies immediately. Even if irregularities exist, he argued, that doesn't prove intent. Zane returned to his seat, still calm, still impossible to provoke. Sloan opened another document. We also recovered routing overlaps connecting Northline Advisory to a private holding structure linked to one of your former university associates. Grant looked directly at her. That's circumstantial. It's financial. Silence. Outside the conference room windows, gray clouds drifted slowly above Cambridge while morning traffic crawled through wet streets below. Inside, the walls had started cracking. At 10:26 a.m., Ethan Pike cornered two sales managers near the espresso machine outside the executive floor. This whole thing's insane, he muttered nervously. Grant says compliance teams are overreaching. One manager lowered her voice. They found fake vendors. That doesn't mean fraud. The second manager looked uneasy. They froze two executive expense accounts this morning. Ethan stopped talking. That was new. Account freezes meant legal escalation. For the first time since the audit began, genuine fear entered the edges of office conversation. Not rumor, not speculation. Fear. Meanwhile, downstairs, Rutherford analysts continued reconstructing deleted communications. One recovered email froze the entire audit room. From Grant Holloway, subject, keep routing consistent. The attached payment instructions referenced Northline Advisory directly. Another message referenced keeping finance blind until Q4. Sloan read both silently before closing the laptop halfway. Then she looked toward the hallway where Zane passed carrying black coffee back toward systems. Still quiet. Still ordinary. Still wearing the same worn charcoal jacket everyone mocked behind his back. And yet every major discovery now traced through archives he preserved. At 11:03 a.m., Sloan approached him again. We'll need formal statements soon. Okay, you understand this may become criminal. I assumed that already. You don't seem surprised by much. Zane looked through the office glass toward the executive floor elevators. People reveal themselves eventually, he said. Usually when money disappears. Sloan studied him another second before walking away, because she had begun realizing something deeper. Zane Flores wasn't simply prepared. He had been patient enough to let dishonest people build their own trap while believing they remained untouchable. And upstairs, Grant Holloway still hadn't fully understood how dangerous the quiet man with the cracked phone actually was. But he was getting closer, fast. Wednesday began with rain. Cold, steady rain that painted the windows of Halcyon Therapeutics in gray streaks and turned the streets outside Kendall Square into reflections of brake lights and umbrellas. Inside the building, nobody talked about quarterly projections anymore. Nobody talked about expansion plans. The only subject left was the audit. At 7:55 a.m., employees arrived quietly moving through the lobby with the careful posture people carried around hospitals and courtrooms. Even Ethan Pike stopped making jokes in elevators. That alone told people how serious things had become. Zane Flores stepped off the elevator onto the fourth floor carrying black coffee in one hand and the same worn backpack over his shoulder. His old Android phone buzzed softly inside his coat pocket. He ignored it for the moment. Across the office floor, systems analysts pretended to work while constantly checking internal chat threads for rumors. One message spread quickly. That morning, emergency board session, 9 a.m., executive level access restricted. People noticed when lawyers started appearing before sunrise. By 8:21, black sedans lined the curb outside Halcyon's main entrance. Additional legal counsel arrived carrying leather document cases. Rutherford compliance personnel moved between floors with visible urgency now. Security officers stood straighter near executive corridors. The atmosphere no longer resembled an audit. It resembled containment. At 8:43, Rebecca Sloan approached Zane's desk. The board wants you upstairs. Zane locked his monitor calmly. Now, yes. Sloan hesitated briefly. They've seen the reconstructed payment chains. Zane stood without asking further questions. He already knew what that meant. The executive boardroom occupied the top floor overlooking the Charles River. Normally, the room projected power. Today, it projected strain. Coffee cups sat untouched beside legal binders. Rain tapped softly against the glass walls while executives avoided looking directly at one another. Grant Holloway stood near the far window speaking sharply with outside counsel when Zane entered. Vanessa Reed sat already seated pale and silent beside a stack of financial reports. Several board members looked exhausted. One elderly director rubbed his forehead continuously as though fighting a migraine. Rebecca Sloan closed the boardroom doors behind them. The meeting began immediately. Board Chairman Leonard Givens adjusted his glasses carefully. "Miss Sloan," he said, "please summarize the current situation." Sloan opened a black portfolio. Rutherford Compliance has identified multiple shell vendor structures tied to executive-level authorization chains within Halcyon Therapeutics. She slid printed packets across the table. Current documented exposure exceeds $11 million. The room stayed silent. Nobody looked surprised anymore. Only worse. Grant leaned forward immediately. These conclusions remain speculative. Sloan did not react. "We recovered deleted communications, mirrored transaction logs offshore, routing overlaps, and synchronized authorization records." Grant turned sharply toward the board. "This entire investigation relies on back-end system interpretations provided by IT personnel." There it was again. The redirect. The attempt to reduce evidence into technical confusion. Grant pointed openly now toward Zane. "We are talking about archived server records maintained by a systems analyst, not criminal investigators." Several board members looked uncertain. Exactly what Grant wanted. Confusion created space. Vanessa finally spoke quietly. The records were independently verified. Grant turned toward her immediately. "You're accepting this without challenge. I'm accepting the timestamps." The answer irritated him visibly. Grant stepped closer to the table. "Context matters. Consulting structures are complicated. Routing delays happen. Vendor layering happens." "Mailbox companies happen too," one board member asked coldly. Grant ignored him. Sloan placed another document onto the table. "We also identified payment authorization overlaps connected to Northline Advisory Group and former personal associates of Mr. Holloway." Grant laughed once, short, controlled. "You're building narratives from coincidence." Zane sat quietly near the end of the room while lawyers exchanged documents around him. Most people in that position would have defended themselves aggressively, explained, argued. Zane simply observed, because the stronger evidence became the less emotion mattered. Chairman Givens finally looked directly at him. "Mr. Flores." Zane raised his eyes calmly. "You preserved these records?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because the numbers stopped making sense." Grant interrupted immediately. "That's not his decision to make." "No," Zane replied evenly. "It became my responsibility when company data started disappearing." The room quieted again. Grant stared at him, probably for the first time not as background noise, but as a threat. At 9:24, Sloan activated the boardroom display monitor. Transaction maps appeared across the large screen. Color-coded payment flows stretched between Halcyon accounts, shell vendors, offshore holding entities, and secondary redistribution channels. Even non-technical board members could understand it visually. Too much money, too many hidden routes, too many overlaps tied to the same approvals. Sloan highlighted one chain. $3.2 million routed through Northline Advisory over 7 months. Another, additional transfers redirected through Belmere Consulting. Another, executive override credentials connected to all major approvals. Grant folded his arms tightly. Again, back-end access logs proved nothing by themselves. Zane finally stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. He walked calmly toward the display monitor and connected the same scratched external drive from his backpack. No dramatic speech, no performance, just evidence. Folders opened across the screen. Independent timestamp mirrors, server synchronization histories, automated archival sequences. Zane selected one verification chain after another. Each matched perfectly. Impossible to falsify retroactively. A Rutherford analyst spoke quietly from the back. "We confirmed integrity against external synchronization servers." Grant's expression hardened further. Zane opened another file. Deleted approval edits appeared side by side with restored originals. Then email recovery chains. Then offshore routing confirmations. Then authorization overlaps. The room grew quieter with every click. Not emotional quiet, mathematical quiet. The kind that arrived when evidence became too complete to argue against. One board member removed his glasses slowly. My God. Grant looked around the room, realizing momentum had shifted. So he changed tactics again. Fine, he snapped. Maybe mistakes happened. Maybe procedures weren't followed perfectly. But none of this explains why an outside investor suddenly attached a forensic invasion to a rescue package. There it was. The real question. Why $80 million arrived attached to legal knives? Chairman Givens looked toward Sloan. Who exactly authorized this investment structure? Sloan remained professional. The investor requested confidentiality until board disclosure procedures completed. Grant laughed bitterly. Convenient. Then he turned toward the board. You're all letting anonymous financiers dictate corporate governance based on server logs from a systems employee carrying a broken Android phone. Nobody laughed. That silence unsettled him, because until now, mockery always worked in his favor. Today it died in the room before reaching anyone else. Chairman Givens looked toward legal counsel. The senior attorney beside Sloan opened another folder carefully. The investment authority structure places conditional governance rights under Flores Capital Partners. Several board members exchanged confused looks. Grant frowned. Who the hell is Flores Capital? The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Zane. So did Rebecca Sloan. So did Vanessa Reed. One by one, the room followed their eyes. Grant noticed last. And when he did, confusion crossed his face before understanding fully arrived. Small at first, then growing. No, he said quietly. Nobody moved. Rain struck the windows harder outside. The attorney folded his hands. Flores Capital Partners is privately controlled by Mr. Zane Flores. The room stopped breathing for a second. Ethan Pike, seated near the rear wall beside sales leadership, stared openly. One board member blinked twice like he misheard. Grant actually laughed once. Not amusement. Disbelief. You're joking. Nobody answered. Zane remained standing beside the monitor in the same worn charcoal jacket Grant mocked less than 48 hours earlier. Same old phone in his pocket, same calm expression. But now every detail inside the room rearranged itself around him. The funding, the audit, the preserved evidence, the timing, all of it. Grant looked suddenly smaller standing beside the windows. Not physically, structurally. Like a man realizing too late he had spent months humiliating the only person in the building powerful enough to destroy him completely. And Zane still hadn't raised his voice once. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the revelation. Rain pressed against the boardroom windows in soft gray sheets, while downtown Cambridge blurred beneath the storm outside. The silence inside Halcyon's executive floor felt heavier than shouting. Grant Holloway stared at Zane Flores like he was looking at the wrong person wearing the right face. It didn't fit inside his understanding of the world. Not the worn jacket, not the old Android phone, not the man who rode the subway carrying leftovers in a plastic container. People like Grant categorized human value quickly, efficiently, cruelly. And once he decided someone belonged beneath him, he stopped seeing them clearly. That blindness had finally become expensive. Chairman Leonard Givens cleared his throat first. You're telling us, he said carefully, that Mr. Flores personally controls Flores Capital Partners. The attorney from Caldwell and Boone, LLP, nodded. Yes. Grant laughed again, shorter this time. Unstable. No. Absolutely not. Nobody responded. Grant looked directly at Zane. You're a systems analyst. I work in systems analytics, Zane replied calmly. That's not the same thing. No, Zane agreed. It isn't. The answer irritated Grant immediately because it contained no defensiveness, no need for validation. Vanessa Reed remained motionless beside her financial reports, but her expression had changed completely now. Not confusion, recognition. Small details from previous months were rearranging themselves in her mind. The calm, the silence, the refusal to react during humiliations. People without power usually flinched eventually. Zane never had. Rebecca Sloan closed another file folder carefully. Mr. Flores founded Flores Capital Partners 11 years ago, following the acquisition of MedCore Predictive Systems. Several board members looked stunned. One whispered quietly, "Jesus Christ." Grant looked around the room, searching for resistance, for someone to laugh. Nobody did. Zane stood near the monitor with one hand resting loosely against the conference table. Still quiet, still composed. His phone vibrated once inside his coat pocket. He ignored it. Grant stepped forward aggressively. So what, he snapped. "You hide money and play undercover billionaire. That's supposed to impress people." "No," Zane said. "That wasn't the point." "Then what was?" Finally, the room leaned toward the answer. Zane looked at the transaction map still glowing across the monitor. "The Oncology Research Division was 6 weeks from shutdown," he said evenly. 3 clinical trials were about to lose funding. 120 employees were scheduled for layoffs, while executive consulting payments continued through shell vendors. Nobody interrupted him, because every sentence connected directly to evidence already verified. Zane continued. "Halcyon had valuable science buried under financial theft." Grant scoffed loudly. "You think you're some kind of savior now?" "No." Again, calm. Always calm. "I think systems fail when dishonest people control them too long." The room stayed silent, not because the statement sounded dramatic, because it sounded true. Chairman Givens removed his glasses slowly. "Mr. Flores, why keep working here?" That question carried genuine confusion. A man with hundreds of millions under management did not spend mornings fixing server permissions and riding the red line to work. Most wealthy people performed their status constantly. Cars, watches, titles, visibility. Zane looked toward the rain outside before answering. "Because the work mattered," he said. "The research mattered. And the money." Zane almost smiled at that. "Money stopped being interesting years ago." Grant shook his head sharply. "This is insane." But his voice lacked force now, not because he accepted the truth, because he finally understood how exposed he was. Every joke about the phone, every insult, every dismissal, all delivered to the man who now effectively controlled Halcyon's survival. Vanessa finally spoke quietly. "You funded the company yourself?" "Yes." $80 million. "Yes." "And attached a forensic audit?" "Yes." No emotion in the answers, no performance. That frightened Vanessa more than anger would have, because angry people could be manipulated. Calm people usually already planned everything. At 9:48 a.m., Rebecca Sloan slid another document toward the chairman. Based on current findings, she said professionally, "Rutherford Compliance recommends immediate executive restriction pending full forensic review." Grant looked sharply toward her. "You can't suspend me based on preliminary assumptions." Sloan held his gaze evenly. "We can under Investor Protection Authority." Grant turned toward the board. "You're seriously considering this?" Nobody answered immediately. Several members avoided eye contact altogether. Cowards often stayed silent before abandoning someone publicly. Grant realized that too. He pointed suddenly toward Zane. "This entire thing was orchestrated." "Yes," Zane said. The direct answer startled the room. Grant blinked once. Zane continued. "I funded the company specifically to trigger legal audit authority." Another silence. Heavy. Measured. One board member whispered, "My God!" Grant spread his hands angrily. "So this was revenge number." Zane's eyes met his steadily. "If I wanted revenge, I would have let Halcyon collapse." That sentence hit harder than shouting ever could have, because it carried no exaggeration, only fact. Vanessa lowered her eyes toward the table. For the first time since the audit began, visible shame crossed her expression. Not for mocking him. For realizing the company survived despite them, not because of them. At 10:03 a.m., Ethan Pike sat near the rear wall looking physically sick. The sales director who once joked loudly about Zane's phone now avoided even breathing too loudly. He replayed every lunchroom insult in his head. Every laugh, every careless comment. And worse than humiliation was the realization that Zane remembered all of it, yet still chose to save the company anyway. That kind of restraint unsettled people. because it forced them to confront themselves. Grant made one final attempt at control. "You think this makes you better than everyone?" he demanded. "No," Zane answered immediately. "I think evidence matters more than image." The room stayed still. Rain continued sliding down the massive glass windows overlooking the river. Below them, traffic moved through Cambridge like nothing extraordinary was happening. Inside the boardroom, careers were ending quietly. Rebecca Sloan handed another packet toward legal counsel. "We recovered deleted routing instructions from Mr. Holloway's executive account late Sunday night." Grant looked toward the folder instantly. His face changed. Small movement, but real. Fear finally breaking through. "Those records are incomplete," he said quickly. "Recovered directly from mirrored backup clusters," Sloan replied. Grant turned toward the board again. "This is absurd. You're trusting system archives over executive leadership." Chairman Givens looked exhausted now. "No," he said quietly. "We're trusting evidence over explanations." Grant opened his mouth again, then stopped. Because there was nothing left to say. The evidence chain was too complete, and the quiet man he spent months humiliating had built the structure carefully enough that every denial only tightened the trap further. At 10:19 a.m., the board chairman folded his hands. Pending completion of forensic review, he announced slowly, "Grant Holloway is hereby suspended from executive authority, effective immediately." Grant stared at him. "You're making a mistake." Nobody answered. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. Two corporate security officers appeared outside the glass boardroom doors moments later. Not aggressive, professional, which somehow made it worse. Grant looked around the room one final time, searching for support. He found none. Then his eyes landed on Zane again, still standing calmly beside the monitor. Same worn jacket, same old phone, same measured expression. Nothing about him had changed. Only the truth around him had finally become visible. One security officer opened the door quietly. "Mr. Holloway," he said respectfully, "we need you to come with us." Grant didn't move immediately. For a moment, anger flashed across his face, but beneath it sat something unfamiliar. The realization that the man he dismissed as invisible had been watching everything the entire time. And now the system itself was closing around him, slowly, legally, completely. Grant Holloway did not leave quietly. At 10:27 a.m., the suspended executive walked out of Halcyon's boardroom, flanked by two corporate security officers, while employees across the executive floor pretended not to stare. Pretending failed. Glass office walls reflected everything. Whispers followed him down the hallway like smoke. Phones lowered slowly. Laptop screens tilted away. People sensed collapse before official announcements ever arrived. Grant still wore the same expensive navy suit, same polished shoes, same silver watch that caught the hallway lights each time he moved his hands angrily while arguing with legal counsel beside the elevators. But the confidence was gone. Not completely. Men like Grant never lost arrogance all at once. It peeled away in layers. First certainty, then control. Then the realization that systems once protecting them had quietly changed sides. Zane Flores watched from the far end of the corridor near the conference room entrance. Not triumphant, not emotional, just observant. Grant noticed him immediately, their eyes locked across nearly 30 feet of polished marble flooring and glass partitions. For a second, the hallway noise faded beneath the weight of that moment. Grant stepped away from the security officers. "This isn't over," he said sharply. Nobody else in the hallway moved. Zane remained still. "I know," he replied calmly. Grant looked almost unsettled by the lack of hostility. "You think money makes you untouchable? No. Then what exactly do you think this is?" Zane glanced briefly toward the boardroom doors behind him. "I think you underestimated how long quiet people can watch before they act." The answer landed harder than shouting would have, because it carried no performance, only truth. Grant stared at him another second before one of the security officers intervened carefully. "Mr. Holloway, we need to continue downstairs." Grant pulled his arm away irritably. "I'm walking." He disappeared toward the elevators moments later while hallway conversations instantly reignited behind him in whispers. A junior legal assistant murmured, "Holy hell." Another employee asked quietly, "Was Zane actually the investor?" Nobody answered confidently yet, But the rumor had already escaped the boardroom, and rumors traveled through struggling companies faster than official memos ever could. At 11:02 a.m., Rutherford Compliance formally expanded the investigation. More servers were mirrored, executive email histories frozen, financial routing permissions suspended. By lunchtime, even senior managers realized this was no longer an internal corporate issue. This was becoming criminal. Inside the temporary audit room on the 7th floor, Rebecca Sloan reviewed new findings with her team while multiple screens displayed reconstructed communication timelines. One auditor looked up from his monitor. We recovered additional deletion attempts from Holloway's credentials after midnight Sunday. Another frowned. He was trying to wipe outbound correspondence. Did it work? The auditor shook his head. Not against mirrored backups. Sloan glanced toward the glass wall where Zane stood quietly reviewing server authorization histories beside another analyst. The strange part wasn't the evidence anymore. It was how prepared he had been. 9 months of structured archival preservation, independent timestamp verification, layered backups hidden beneath ordinary systems maintenance. Not emotional retaliation. Strategic patience. At 11:26 a.m., Ethan Pike finally approached Zane directly. The sales director looked exhausted now. His usual loud confidence had collapsed into nervous energy. "Hey," Ethan said awkwardly near the coffee station. Zane looked up from his tablet. "Yes?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "So, people are saying things. They usually do." The calm answer made Ethan uncomfortable. "I didn't know," Ethan said quickly, "about any of this." "I know. And the jokes," Ethan forced a weak laugh. "You know office stuff." Zane stirred black coffee slowly. "Office stuff usually tells you who people are." Ethan looked away immediately, because there was no cruelty in the statement, only accuracy, that somehow felt worse. Before Ethan could respond, Zane's phone vibrated again. The cracked screen illuminated with another secure notification. Federal review request submitted. He locked the screen instantly, but Ethan had already seen enough words to understand something much larger was happening. "You brought in federal investigators," he whispered. "I preserved evidence," Zane replied. "That's not the same thing." "No," Zane said calmly. "It isn't." At 12:14 p.m., Vanessa Reed requested a private meeting, not with attorneys, not with the board, with Zane. They met inside a small conference room overlooking the river. Rain still drifted lightly outside while cargo boats moved slowly through the gray water below. Vanessa remained standing initially. She looked exhausted. "You could have exposed this months ago," she said quietly. Zane sat near the end of the table. "Yes. Why wait?" "Because without leverage they would have buried it." Vanessa didn't deny that, which told him enough. She folded her arms tightly. "I knew some vendor structures looked questionable. But you signed approvals." Her jaw tightened. "I signed what Grant told me was temporary. $11 million temporary." The question wasn't aggressive. That made it worse. Vanessa finally sat down. For the first time since the audit began, she looked less like an executive and more like someone realizing the size of the fire around her. "You really worked here this whole time?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "Why?" "Because Halcyon mattered. You could have bought the company years ago. Buying something doesn't fix its culture." Vanessa looked toward the rain outside. "You know everyone's terrified of you now." Zane almost smiled at that. They shouldn't be, but they are, because people feared calm power more than loud authority. Grant demanded attention. Zane never needed it. That difference changed rooms. At 1:03 p.m., Rutherford investigators uncovered another major problem. Grant Holloway had attempted external contact with one of the offshore intermediaries connected to Belmere Consulting shortly after his suspension. Worse, he used a private encrypted account previously hidden from internal disclosure records. The message was short: clean everything. That was enough. Rebecca Sloan immediately escalated the case. By 1:40 p.m., federal financial crimes investigators formally contacted Rutherford Compliance, requesting preserved evidence transfer authorization. The building changed again after that. People stopped treating the situation like corporate scandal. Now it felt dangerous. At 2:11 p.m., two FBI financial crimes agents entered Halcyon through the main lobby. No uniforms, dark coats, professional posture. Employees noticed instantly anyway. Marcus, the security guard downstairs, watched silently while the agents signed visitor clearance forms. One of them asked, "Where's Flores?" Marcus pointed toward the elevators. "Fourth floor." "Of course." Meanwhile, Zane sat alone in the systems department reviewing another layer of archived routing structures. The old Android phone rested charging beside him, tape peeling slightly near the cable connection. Same phone, same desk, same quiet routine. Outside the office, glass employees glanced toward him differently now. Not mockery anymore. Distance, caution, respect mixed uneasily with fear. At 2:24 p.m., Rebecca Sloan entered beside the two federal investigators. "Mr. Flores," she said calmly, "these agents would like to speak with you." Zane stood slowly. One investigator extended a badge. "Special Agent Daniel Mercer, Financial Crimes Division." The second nodded once. "We understand you've been preserving evidence related to Halcyon's internal fraud structure." "Yes." Mercer studied him briefly. Most whistleblowers look nervous around federal agents. Zane looked prepared. "You expected this eventually," Mercer observed. "Yes." Why, Zane glanced toward the server room behind the glass wall. "Because systems always leave traces," he said quietly. "And eventually someone follows them." The agents exchanged a brief look. Not suspicion, recognition. They had spent years dealing with panic lies, emotional collapses, and desperate explanations. Zane Flores gave them none of that. Only records, only patience, only evidence. And somewhere deep inside Halcyon Therapeutics, people were finally starting to understand the most dangerous man in the building had never been the loud executive with the expensive watch. The Thursday morning arrived quieter than the others. Not calmer, just quieter. By then, everyone inside Halcyon Therapeutics understood the company had crossed a line it could never fully uncross. Federal investigators occupied temporary offices on the 7th floor. Rutherford Compliance controlled large portions of internal financial access. Legal teams moved through hallways carrying sealed document boxes, while executives avoided eye contact with ordinary employees. Even the elevators sounded different. Less conversation, more silence. At 7:18 a.m., Zane Flores stepped off the Red Line station carrying the same black backpack beneath a cold Boston drizzle. Nothing about him had changed externally. Same charcoal jacket, same old Android phone, same measured pace through crowded sidewalks near Kendall Square. But now employees noticed him before he entered rooms. People straightened when he walked past. Voices lowered. Not because he demanded authority, because they finally understood he never needed to. Inside Halcyon's lobby, Marcus, the security guard, nodded carefully. "Morning, Mr. Flores?" Zane paused slightly. "Morning, Marcus." The guard hesitated before speaking again. "My daughter works in oncology research downstairs." Zane looked at him. "She told me layoffs got paused." "Yes." Marcus nodded slowly. "Appreciate that." Simple words, quiet words. But they stayed with Zane longer than the boardroom revelations ever had. Because that was the actual reason he invested $80 million. Not prestige, not revenge. People. At 8:03 a.m., he entered the systems department and found something unusual waiting on his desk. A paper coffee cup from Tat Bakery. Still warm, no note attached. He looked around the office. Several employees avoided eye contact immediately. One junior analyst finally spoke awkwardly. Figured you probably didn't have time to grab breakfast." Zane studied the coffee briefly, then nodded once. "Thank you." The analyst looked almost relieved, because kindness became complicated after people realized how badly they misjudged someone. At 8:41, Special Agent Daniel Mercer met Zane inside a temporary interview room converted from an unused compliance office. Rain tapped softly against the narrow window, while Mercer reviewed several printed timelines. "You archived records for 9 months," Mercer said. "Yes." "You never tipped off management." "No." "You never threatened exposure." "No." Mercer leaned back slightly. "Most people in your position eventually get emotional." Zane looked toward the folders spread across the table. Emotion makes people careless. Mercer almost smiled at that. Where'd you learn patience like this? The question lingered longer than expected, because the answer wasn't simple. Zane rested one arm against the table. 10 years ago, he said quietly, I built predictive infrastructure software for biomedical research firms. Mercer listened without interrupting. We sold the company to a larger acquisition group after 18 months. How much enough? Mercer waited. Zane continued. After that, everyone around me changed. He remembered it clearly. Private equity dinners in Manhattan, luxury parties in San Francisco hillsides. People measuring human value through watches, investment portfolios, and invitation lists. Everyone performing importance constantly. Everyone terrified of becoming invisible. I realized something Zane said. What? The louder wealth becomes, the less secure it usually is. Mercer folded his hands thoughtfully. So you disappeared. I simplified. No yacht photos, no interviews, no magazines. Flores Capital Partners grew quietly through biotech infrastructure acquisitions and long-hold research investments. While Zane lived inside ordinary routines most wealthy people would consider punishment. Subway rides, small apartments, cheap coffee. Normality protected clarity. At 9:26 a.m., Rutherford investigators finalized another fraud map connecting Belmere Consulting to offshore redistribution accounts in Cyprus and Luxembourg. The numbers worsened daily. More executives became implicated. Several department heads retained outside counsel before noon. Meanwhile, ordinary employees kept working. Scientists returned to lab testing. Analysts rebuilt budgets. Researchers who thought they would lose careers last week now cautiously discussed future clinical timelines again. Hope returned slowly this time, more carefully. At 10:11, a woman from oncology research stopped outside Zane's desk. Her ID badge read Dr. Emily Harper, early 30s, exhausted eyes, hands trembling slightly. I wanted to say something, she said quietly. Zane looked up from his monitor. Emily swallowed once before continuing. A few months ago, Ethan Pike was joking about your phone in the cafeteria. Zane remembered. I laughed too. He said nothing. Emily looked embarrassed now. We thought you were just... She stopped herself. I don't know. Forgettable Zane offered calmly. Her face flushed. I'm sorry. That part mattered. Not because of the insult. Because sincere apologies had become rare in corporate environments. Zane closed the file on his screen. You were worried about fitting in, he said. Emily stared at him, surprised. That's how places like this work. She looked down briefly. My research team would have been shut down next month. I know. The funding came from you. Yes. Emily nodded slowly while trying to process the contradiction standing in front of her. The quiet systems analyst people mocked over lunch had just preserved years of cancer research. She almost asked why he never defended himself. But the answer already sat in the room. He didn't need to. After she left, Zane stared briefly at the cracked screen of his phone charging beside the keyboard. Battery health warning flashed again. The device was finally starting to fail. Interesting timing. At 11:02 a.m., Vanessa Reed officially entered cooperation discussions with federal investigators. News spread through the building within minutes. Grant Holloway remained unreachable after retaining outside criminal counsel. Employees watched executive collapse unfold in real time through rumors, security movements, and disappearing names from organizational charts. Yet Zane still arrived exactly on schedule, still ate simple lunches, still sat at the same desk. That consistency unsettled people more than sudden power ever could. At 12:18 p.m., Ethan Pike approached cautiously holding a cafeteria tray. Mind if I sit? Zane nodded once. Ethan sat across from him in uncomfortable silence for several seconds before speaking. I was awful to you. Direct. No jokes this time. Zane opened a bottled water calmly. You liked having an audience. Ethan gave a weak laugh. Yeah. The honesty surprised even him. I thought people respected confidence, Ethan admitted. They usually respect safety, Zane replied. Ethan frowned slightly. What's the difference? Confidence doesn't need cruelty. The sentence stayed between them. Heavy, precise. Ethan looked around the cafeteria where employees now glanced toward Zane carefully whenever he moved. You know what the crazy part is, Ethan said quietly. You could have humiliated all of us. Zane unwrapped his sandwich. That wouldn't improve anything. Ethan stared at him. Because most people with sudden moral advantage used it aggressively. Zane never did, and that forced others to sit alone with what they had become. At 1:07 p.m., Zane returned to his desk and opened another archived routing file for federal review. Outside the office windows, rain clouds finally started breaking apart above Cambridge. Thin sunlight touched the river faintly in the distance. His phone vibrated again. Low battery warning, 5%. He plugged in the taped charger carefully. The cable connection flickered twice before stabilizing. Across the office floor, employees worked quietly beneath fluorescent lights, while the company slowly rebuilt itself around the collapse of people who once believed appearance guaranteed power. Zane leaned back slightly in his chair. Tired now. Not victorious, tired. Because saving broken systems always costs more energy than destroying them. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion sat one uncomfortable truth he still hadn't fully resolved. He had spent months protecting people who laughed while watching him eat alone. Yet somehow, that still felt easier than becoming the kind of man who needed revenge to feel important. By Friday morning, Halcyon Therapeutics no longer felt like a company under investigation. It felt like a company being rebuilt in real time. Walls didn't change, furniture didn't change, but people did. Names disappeared from internal directories overnight. Executive access permissions were frozen. Entire approval chains were rerouted through compliance systems controlled by federal oversight and Rutherford investigators. The power structure that once felt permanent had started dissolving quietly, like ink in water. At 7:32 a.m., Zane Flores stepped into the building and immediately noticed the difference. No laughter in elevators, no casual jokes near the security desk. Even Ethan Pike avoided the usual loud entrance he used to make every morning. Fear had replaced performance, but underneath fear, something else was forming. Relief. Marcus the security guard nodded as Zane passed. Things are changing fast in here, Marcus said quietly. Zane replied simply. They were always going to. Inside the systems department, Zane found a new notification waiting on his terminal. Board restructure proposal review required. He opened it without hesitation. Halcyon's board, now operating under external oversight, had begun restructuring leadership positions. Vanessa Reed had submitted formal resignation papers overnight. Grant Holloway remained under federal investigation and was now legally restricted from entering company premises without council approval. The remaining board members were attempting to stabilize operations before investor panic spread further. But stability was no longer something Halcyon controlled. It was something being negotiated. At 8:11 a.m., Rebecca Sloan entered the system's floor again. She looked more tired than before. Long night, she said. Zane nodded slightly. Report Sloan placed a folder on his desk. Vanessa Reed resigned. Full cooperation agreement with federal authorities. Zane scanned the document briefly. No surprises. Sloan studied him carefully. You're not reacting to any of this. I already saw it coming. That answer wasn't arrogance. It was pattern recognition. Sloan leaned against the desk slightly. The board wants to offer you something. Zane looked up. Go on. A formal executive advisory position, full control over data infrastructure oversight, and a seat in restructuring decisions. Zane closed the folder. No. Sloan blinked once. That response surprised her more than anything else in the entire investigation. Most people in your position would accept influence. I don't want influence, Zane said calmly. What do you want? Zane paused for a moment, glancing through the glass wall toward the office floor where employees were quietly working. Stability, he said. Sloan nodded slowly. That's rare. I know. At 9:04 a.m., Ethan Pike finally approached Zane's desk without his usual energy. No jokes, no sarcasm, just hesitation. Hey, Ethan said. Zane looked up. Yes. Ethan rubbed his hands together once. So, the restructuring is real, huh? Yes, and Grant's done for now. Ethan nodded slowly, then looked down. I keep thinking about something. Zane waited. Ethan continued. All those times I joked about your phone, your clothes, everything. Silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, just honest. I thought I was just keeping things light, Ethan said. You were reinforcing hierarchy, Zane replied. Ethan gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. Yeah, that sounds worse when you say it out loud. Zane didn't respond because it was worse. Ethan exhaled slowly. You could have ruined all of us. Yes, but you didn't. Zane looked at him directly. Ruining people doesn't fix systems. That sentence landed heavier than Ethan expected because it removed the comfort of blame. It left only responsibility. At 10:26 a.m., federal investigators expanded access to Halcyon's offshore financial tracking systems. By midday, additional shell entities tied to Grant Holloway's approval network were frozen. Several external consulting firms were placed under subpoena. The financial web unraveled faster than anyone predicted, not because it was complex, but because it was careless. Greed always left patterns behind, patterns Zane had already preserved. At 12:09 p.m., Dr. Emily Harper returned to Zane's desk again. This time, she wasn't alone. Two researchers stood behind her. All three looked nervous. We wanted to thank you, Emily said. Zane looked at them. For what? Emily glanced at the others before speaking. For not letting the research die. One of the researchers added quietly, We were preparing to shut down Phase 2 trials next month. Zane nodded once. I know. Emily hesitated. Why did you do it? That question again. People kept asking it like there should be a dramatic answer. Zane leaned back slightly. Because the data mattered, he said. That's it. Yes. Emily studied him carefully. No revenge, no agenda. Zane shook his head once. I don't operate on emotions. That wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough to be understood. After they left, Zane returned to his screen. But for the first time in days, he didn't immediately open financial logs or audit maps. Instead, he sat still, watching the cursor blink. At 1:33 p.m., Rebecca Sloan returned again. This time her expression was different. Not tired, not analytical, serious. The board finalized restructuring, she said. Zane looked up. And you are now the largest controlling stakeholder in Halcyon Therapeutics through Flores Capital Partners. He didn't react immediately, not because it was surprising, but because it wasn't the outcome he had focused on. Sloan continued. Operational leadership will be reassigned under federal compliance supervision. Your role is effectively foundational. Zane closed his laptop slowly. That wasn't the objective, he said. Sloan nodded. I believe you. That was what made it real. Not suspicion, not celebration, understanding. At 2:11 p.m., a formal company-wide announcement was sent. Employees gathered quietly around monitors across every floor reading the update. Grant Holloway terminated pending federal charges. Vanessa Reed resigned effective immediately. Northline Advisory Group under investigation. Financial recovery procedures initiated. And one additional line that caused more confusion than anything else. Strategic investor identity confirmed Flores Capital Partners Zane Flores. Across the building, silence followed. Not shock anymore. Something closer to recalibration. People were rewriting their understanding of the last several months in real time. The man they mocked over lunch. The old phone. The quiet presence in meetings. It all rearranged itself into something heavier, something irreversible. At 3:40 p.m., Ethan Pike stood alone near the cafeteria window watching rain begin again outside. He didn't joke, didn't smile. For once, he looked like someone who understood how fragile status actually was. Behind him, employees whispered less, worked more. And across the glass walls of the systems floor, Zane Flores continued reviewing infrastructure logs unchanged in posture, unchanged in routine. But the building around him no longer saw him as invisible, or replaceable, or ordinary. They saw him as the reason the company still existed, and Zane, for his part, remained exactly the same, which somehow made everything even more unsettling. Monday morning arrived with a different silence, not the tense silence of investigation, not the fearful silence of collapse. This was the silence of a company that had already been broken and was now being rebuilt under new rules. At 7:41 a.m., Halcyon Therapeutics opened its doors to employees who no longer knew what version of the company they were walking into. Some came expecting layoffs, some came expecting celebration. Most came simply to see what remained. Zane Flores arrived at 7:59 a.m., stepping off the red line with the same worn backpack and the same cracked Android phone in his coat pocket. Nothing about his appearance had changed, but everything around him had. The security guard Marcus straightened when Zane entered the lobby. "Morning, Mr. Flores," Marcus said. Zane paused slightly. "Morning." Then Marcus added quietly, almost respectfully, "Now, they're calling a full company meeting." Zane nodded once. "I know." By 9 a.m., every employee was instructed to gather in the main conference hall on the 12th floor. The room that once hosted quarterly optimism presentations now felt different. No catered breakfast, no polished marketing slides, no executive theater, just chairs, people, and uncertainty. The atmosphere was stripped down to something raw, truth without decoration. Zane entered last, not intentionally. That was simply how he moved, without urgency, without performance. But this time something unusual happened. No laughter followed him, no whispers about his phone, no jokes about his clothes. People looked at him directly now, some with guilt, some with curiosity, some with quiet recognition they didn't know how to express. He took a seat near the side wall. Same place, different meaning. At 9:12 a.m., Rebecca Sloan stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room. She did not look like an executive anymore. She looked like someone managing transition. Behind her, a single screen displayed a plain title, Halcyon Therapeutics Structural Reset. Sloan spoke calmly. "Over the past several days, Halcyon Therapeutics has undergone full forensic review, federal financial inspection, and investor-led restructuring. No one interrupted, no one moved. Several leadership changes have already taken place," she continued. "Additional governance adjustments will continue over the coming weeks." She paused briefly. "This company will not return to what it was." That sentence landed heavily. Not because it was emotional, because it was final. Sloan continued. "However, Halcyon will continue operating." A ripple moved through the room, relief. Subtle, careful, but real. Then she said something unexpected. "This continuity is due to one condition set by our primary investor." All eyes shifted slightly, even those who already knew. Sloan turned slightly toward the side of the room. "Zane Flores." Silence deepened instantly. Zane didn't move, didn't react, didn't acknowledge attention. Sloan continued. "Under Flores Capital Partners' governance framework, funding was provided specifically to preserve research continuity, employee stability, and scientific integrity." A researcher near the front quietly exhaled. Someone else whispered, "We're safe." Sloan nodded. "As long as operations remain transparent and compliant, yes." The room shifted again. Fear softened. Confusion replaced it. But underneath everything was something else forming, understanding. Sloan stepped down from the stage slowly. "That concludes the formal announcement." She paused, then added one more sentence. "The company is still here because of structured intervention." She left the stage, and silence returned, this time heavier than before, because now people were trying to process what survival actually meant. At 9:24 a.m., Ethan Pike finally stood near the back row. No humor, no performance, just hesitation. He looked toward Zane, then spoke loudly enough for nearby employees to hear. "I owe you an apology." The room shifted slightly. Zane looked at him. Ethan continued. "I was wrong about you." Silence tightened again. "I thought you were just invisible." His voice lowered slightly. "You weren't." Zane didn't respond immediately, because apologies weren't complicated, but acceptance of them often was. Finally, he said, "People assume visibility equals value." Ethan nodded slowly. "I learned that the hard way." Zane looked away. That was enough. At 10:03 a.m., Sloan called for department-level restructuring meetings. But something unusual happened as employees left the auditorium. They didn't scatter. They didn't joke. They didn't return to normal office behavior. Instead, they walked differently, more carefully, more aware, as if the building itself had changed ownership of perception. Back on the fourth floor, Zane returned to his desk. The systems office felt quieter than ever, not because fewer people were there, but because everyone had learned to listen differently. On his desk sat something unexpected, a new phone box, unopened, no label, just placed carefully beside his keyboard. Ethan Pike stood a few feet away. "I didn't know what kind you use," Ethan said awkwardly. "So I just got something modern." Zane looked at it, then at Ethan. "You didn't need to do that." "I know." A pause. "I just thought maybe it's time people stop remembering you for the wrong thing." Zane didn't answer immediately. Then he slid the box slightly aside. "I don't need a new phone." Ethan nodded. "I figured," and walked away. No joke, no laughter, just understanding settling into place slowly. At 11:28 a.m., federal investigators completed final documentation review on Grant Holloway's case files. At 12:11 p.m., Vanessa Reed's cooperation agreement was formally accepted. At 1:04 p.m., Halcyon's new interim board ratified emergency governance reforms. But none of those updates felt like the real change anymore. The real change had already happened in people. At 2:37 p.m., Dr. Emily Harper approached Zane again. This time, she didn't speak immediately. She simply placed a printed research summary on his desk. "Clinical Phase 2 is back online," she said. Zane looked at the document, then at her. "That was fast." "We didn't want to lose another week," she replied. A pause. Then she added quietly, "People are working harder now." Zane nodded once. "Good." Emily hesitated before leaving, then turned back briefly. "For what it's worth," she said, "most of us didn't deserve your help." Zane finally looked at her directly. "That's not how systems work," he said. "They don't reward deserving, they reward stability." Emily absorbed that, then nodded slowly, and left. By 3:15 p.m., Zane was alone in the systems office. Rain returned outside the windows, soft, steady. The city of Cambridge moved on like nothing had changed. But inside Halcyon Therapeutics, everything had. Zane looked at his old Android phone. The cracked screen flickered slightly. Low battery warning appeared again. He plugged it in carefully, watched the charging icon stabilize, then leaned back in his chair. For the first time in weeks, there was nothing urgent on his screen. No fraud chains, no audit maps, no emergency logs. Just systems running normally. It should have felt like victory. But Zane didn't think in those terms. He never had. Instead, he simply sat in silence while the building around him adjusted to a reality it had ignored for too long. Power had not disappeared. It had just been sitting quietly in the corner the entire time. And now, it had finished watching. 3 months later, Halcyon Therapeutics no longer looked like a company recovering from collapse. It looked like a company learning how to function without illusions. The glass walls of the Kendall Square headquarters still reflected the same gray Boston skies, but the energy inside had changed completely. No more loud executive entrances, no more performative meetings, no more laughter that depended on someone else being smaller. What replaced it was quieter, structured, careful, real. At 7:52 a.m., Zane Flores stepped off the red line as he always did. Same worn charcoal jacket, same black backpack, same cracked Android phone that still refused to fully die even after repeated warnings. But something subtle had changed around him. People noticed him now, without pretending not to. A receptionist at the lobby desk stood a little straighter when he passed. 2 engineers in the hallway paused their conversation and waited for him to walk by before continuing. Not fear, not worship. Recognition. Zane didn't acknowledge it. He never encouraged it. He simply moved through the building the same way he always had, quiet, precise, unbothered by attention. Inside the systems department, the environment had stabilized into something unfamiliar for Halcyon normal work. No crisis meetings, no emergency audits, no whispered speculation about layoffs, just data research pipelines, server maintenance, and clinical development logs flowing as they were supposed to. At 8:34 a.m., Dr. Emily Harper stopped by his desk. She no longer looked exhausted. Not completely. There was still pressure in her eyes, but it had shifted into something productive. We finalized phase 2 calibration, she said. Zane looked up from his screen. Good. Emily hesitated. Funding continuity is holding. No freezes, no interruptions. Zane nodded once. That's what stability looks like. Emily gave a faint smile. It still feels strange saying that about this place. Zane didn't respond immediately. Because she was right. Halcyon had never been stable before. It had only ever been performing stability. Now it was something else entirely. At 9:11 a.m., Ethan Pike appeared at the entrance of the system's floor. He didn't walk in with his usual confidence. He stood there for a moment, hands in pockets, scanning the room, like he wasn't sure he belonged in it anymore. Finally, he walked over. Hey, Ethan said. Zane didn't look up immediately. Hey, Ethan exhaled slowly. I got reassigned, I know, to internal compliance coordination. Zane nodded. That makes sense. Ethan gave a short laugh. No jokes. No welcome to the basement comments. Zane finally looked at him. I don't need to repeat what people already learned. That made Ethan quiet. He shifted his weight slightly. I used to think you were just lucky to have a job here. Zane returned to his screen. Most people assume what they can't see. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah. A pause. Then quieter. I was wrong about a lot of things. Zane didn't respond immediately. Then, that happens when systems change. Ethan almost smiled. Yeah, they really changed. He hesitated before leaving, then added, For what it's worth, things are better now. Zane looked up briefly. They are more honest, he corrected. Ethan nodded. That too. And then he walked away. No laughter followed him, no jokes, no audience, just understanding. At 10:22 a.m., the systems office received a routine status update from Federal Oversight. Case closed, active monitoring continuing. Zane read it once, then closed the window. Nothing dramatic, no celebration, just closure in the administrative sense. The kind that rarely matched emotional reality. At 11:03 a.m. Marcus. The security guard met Zane in the lobby during a brief shift change. My daughter's research team got extended funding, Marcus said. Zane paused. That's good. Marcus nodded. She asked me to thank you. Zane looked slightly away. Tell her to focus on the work. Marcus smiled. She is. A pause. Then Marcus added, People talk different about you now. Zane didn't answer immediately. He already knew that. What do they say, he asked finally. Marcus hesitated. Most say you saved the company. Zane looked down briefly. That's not accurate. Marcus tilted his head. Then what is Zane thought for a moment? I removed instability. Marcus seemed to consider that, then nodded slowly. Feels like the same thing from where I stand. Zane didn't correct him, because arguing semantics didn't change outcomes. At 12:40 p.m., Zane ate lunch alone near the fourth floor window. Same routine, same simple food. But the atmosphere around him had shifted permanently. People no longer made jokes when passing. They no longer tested boundaries for entertainment. Instead, they worked. Carefully. Consciously. As if every action had weight now. At 1:18 p.m., a delivery arrived at his desk. No sender listed. Inside was a new phone. Modern, minimal, expensive, unactivated. A note was attached. No handwriting, just printed text for when you decide you're done being ignored. Zane stared at it for several seconds, then placed it back in the box. He did not open it. At 2:05 p.m., Rebecca Sloan visited one final time. She no longer carried legal folders, only a thin tablet. We're finalizing transition documentation, she said. Zane nodded. And Halcyon stable, she replied. A pause, then surprisingly stable. Zane looked out the window. Rain had started again outside, soft, consistent. Boston always looked the same in rain. Stability always feels surprising after chaos, he said. Sloan watched him carefully. You never stayed for recognition, she said. Zane shook his head slightly. No. Why stay at all then? That question lingered longer than expected. Zane looked back toward the office floor. Scientists working. Analysts focused. People no longer distracted by fear. Because systems only improve when someone stays long enough to see how they fail, he said. Sloan nodded slowly, then paused. You're leaving eventually. It wasn't a question. Zane didn't deny it. Yes, when it's stable enough without me. Sloan studied him for a moment, then simply said, that might already be true. At 3:30 p.m., Zane finished his final system review cycle. He logged out of the internal monitoring dashboard, closed the last active terminal, disconnected his external archive drive. One by one, the systems he had once watched obsessively fell back into routine operation. At 4:12 p.m., he stood from his desk for the last time that day. No announcement followed him. No farewell meeting, no applause. He simply walked through the system's floor one final time, past analysts who now nodded respectfully, past engineers who no longer joked, past spaces that had once felt hostile and now felt neutral. At the elevator, Marcus, the security guard, met him again. You coming back tomorrow? Marcus asked. Zane paused. Yes. A beat. Until I don't need to. Marcus nodded. I think people are going to miss having you around. Zane stepped into the elevator. The doors began to close. Before they shut completely, Marcus added quietly, You were never invisible, you know. Zane looked at him for a moment. Then the doors closed. The elevator descended. Outside Boston continued moving under gray skies. Inside Halcyon Therapeutics, people worked without fear of collapse for the first time in years. And in a small corner of that system, a man who never needed to be seen had quietly proven that visibility was never the same as value. The phone in his pocket buzzed once. He didn't check it, not because it didn't matter, but because for the first time it didn't need to. Zane Flores never changed the way he looked at the world. What changed was how the world finally learned to look at him. The quiet truth of his story wasn't about money or revenge or even exposure. It was about patience, about what happens when someone observes long enough to understand systems better than the people who abuse them. Most people underestimate silence. They confuse it with weakness. But silence, when combined with awareness, becomes structure. It becomes preparation. And preparation, when ignored long enough, becomes consequence. In real life, not everyone who is mocked is powerless. Not everyone who is loud is right. And not every system survives the people who assume it will never be questioned. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only one paying attention. So the question isn't who gets the most attention in a room, it's who understands the room while everyone else is distracted by themselves. Have you ever underestimated someone and later realized you were wrong? Share your experience in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where quiet people turn out to be the most dangerous variable in the system, subscribe. Because tomorrow's story follows someone who didn't just watch the system fail, they designed it from the start.